This is the G-Wolves HTS Ultra Deluxe, the largest ultralight mouse G-Wolves currently offers, and despite its larger, more normal size, in typical G-Wolves style, the mouse is still incredibly light and features top-of-the-line specs as well as the latest PixArt sensor, the PixArt 3950. As we saw with the HTX Mini, which was an incredible mouse, G-Wolves has shown they can make both tiny fingertip optimized mice as well as more traditional sized ones, but the HTS Ultra is a much bigger mouse than they've made before, and while on paper the HTS Ultra is a very impressive mouse, how it actually feels and performs is a little different than advertised. So in today's episode of the mel0n Review, we're going to take a deep dive and talk in depth about the HTS Ultra's specs, sensor implementation, build quality, weight, pros and cons, and much more. But before we dive in, if you enjoy the review and want to see more in-depth reviews like this one, as well as a full teardown guide for the HTS Ultra, and reviews of the G-Wolves Fenrir and Fenrir ASIM, and the newly announced HTM Plus, which is an even larger mouse than the HTS Ultra, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel so you don't miss those reviews. And if you want to support what I do here on the channel with the in-depth reviews and the teardown project, consider becoming a channel member, as it is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a member gives you early access to all upcoming videos like this one. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I tested the HTS Ultra for approximately 3 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming use. For skates, I tested both types of the included stock skates as well as several aftermarket types, and for sensitivity I used my usual ranges of 40 cm per 360 for fabric pads and 50 cm per 360 for hard pads. And lastly, for firmware, I tested the HTS Ultra on version 1.0.38. For pricing and versions, the HTS Ultra, unlike G-Wolves' other mice, comes in two versions. Firstly, we have the HTS Ultra Standard, which retails for $119 USD, but this version doesn't include all the extra accessories commonly found with G-Wolves mice, as it only comes with the essentials, but this version does come with a 300 mAh battery instead of a 250 mAh battery found on the Deluxe editions, but it is also heavier because of this, and it's only available in an all-black colorway. The second version available is the HTS Ultra Deluxe, which includes 4 colorways: the black, green, and red green, which retail for $149 USD, and the violet and ruby transparent shelled versions, which retail for $159 USD. But unlike the standard versions, all the deluxe versions of the HTS Ultra include the full suite of accessories we've seen included with G-Wolves' other mice I've covered here on the channel, and have a 250 mAh battery, and today I'll be covering the HTS Ultra Deluxe in the black-red colorway. Now, as we've always seen with G-Wolves mice, they include a bunch of fantastic accessories which gives their mice the best unboxing experience you'll find on the market due to the sheer amount of included items, and the same goes here for the HTS Ultra Deluxe Edition. Now, the mouse's box is the same holographic style we've seen used for G-Wolves' previous mice, and sadly it is still featuring AI generated art, which again I'm not a fan of personally speaking. Admittedly, I do feel like I'm kind of beating a dead horse with this, as I've said this so many times now, but nonetheless I'll say it again. I'd much rather see G-Wolves use non-AI art for their packaging or just a plain box as opposed to the current style. I also feel like I'm beating a dead horse when I say you can become a channel member here on YouTube for only $2 per month, and being a channel member not only supports my efforts here on the channel, it also gives you early access to all upcoming content, including videos like this one. But box art aside, inside we have a set of grip tape, a small accessory package, and a gray carrying case. There are also some additional accessories that are packaged separately, but we'll talk about those in a moment. First, let's go ahead and crack open this gray carrying case, which inside will find the same two USB A to C cables we saw included with the HTX Mini, a thicker, more rigid one, and a thinner, more flexible one. We also have the same gray colored semi-transparent 8K Hz polling dongle, which has a very large rubber base on it that helps to keep the dongle well anchored despite its lighter weight. And lastly, wrapped in a fabric wrapper, we have the HTS Ultra itself, which comes with 4 PTFE dot skates pre-installed on it. Now, for the smaller accessory package, it includes a quick start guide for the mouse, 2 base cover stickers you can apply to the mouse's base to deter dust and debris from getting inside, a set of 30 PTFE dot skates, the same type that were pre-installed on the mouse, as well as 2 sets of full-size PTFE skates. And lastly, we have 2 more sets of those foam skate spacers we saw included with the HTX Mini in both 1 and 1.5mm heights. You can use these to raise the height of the mouse's stock skates to make them more compatible with softer pads or higher LOD values, but we'll talk more in depth about these foam pads later in this video. And as I mentioned earlier, the mouse also includes a set of grips, which includes both pre-cut sets, 2 hump cover pieces, and 6 universal pieces. But oddly enough, it doesn't include any side button covers, which is quite disappointing, as the HTS Ultra side buttons can feel quite slippery due to their uncoated nature. But one great improvement to these grips is that the pieces for the mouse aren't solid pieces like like they were on G-Will's previous mice. Instead, they're a modular style, which is a great improvement as it prevents unnecessary weight from being added to the mouse, but we'll talk more about the benefits of these modular grips later in this video. And lastly, we have the extra accessories which came separately packaged, and this includes 4 packs of the G-Will's lightweight clay, which you can use to alter the mouse's shape or create grip points on the mouse's shell or any other mouse for that matter. This is a very underrated accessory in my opinion, and if you want to learn how to properly use this clay, you can check out my guide, which will be linked down in the video description and on screen here. And lastly, we have the same storage baggie that we saw included with the HTX Mini and the HTR Pro, which is designed to keep dust and debris out of the mouse when it's not being used. Now, due to the mouse's open base and hollow honeycomb shell, I would highly recommend using this or placing the mouse back inside its carrying case or fabric wrapper when it's not being used to prevent debris from building up on the inside of the mouse, but ensure that you only store the HTS Ultra using the above methods, as using other types of resealable bags such as a Ziploc bag can generate static charge inside, which can damage your mouse. And for warranty, the HTS Ultra comes with a 1-year manufacturer warranty, the same as all of G-Will's other mice, and you can find the terms and conditions for this warranty over on G-Will's website. For in-game performance, the HTS Ultra, just like other G-Wolves mice I've reviewed before, does perform amazingly well, and the upgrade to the 3950 adds an additional LOD level as well as the center tilt feature, which further adds to the mouse's great performance. And on top of that, despite the new sensor, I didn't run into any issues over my testing on all pad types, and the high polling rates for the mouse are also perfectly implemented as expected for a G-Wolves mouse. But the big selling point here is that despite the larger size, the HTS Ultra is insanely light as expected for a G-Wolves mouse, but this is the biggest and one of the lighter mice they've actually released, and compared to most mice on the market, the HTS Ultra feels borderline weightless in your hand, especially when combined with low friction skates like the XRPad Jade series skates. The HTS Ultra also utilizes a forward sensor position, same as the HTX Mini, which gives the mouse a faster feel, but due to the mouse's larger size, it does take a little longer to get accustomed to this forward sensor than usual, but it does add a nice boost to the mouse's performance. And unlike the HTX Mini, the HTS Ultra's balancing point is matched to the forward sensor position, which is a great improvement. It's also worth mentioning that the mouse's shape is quite good. It's the first G-Wolves mouse I can actually use with a regular grip style, which is a welcome change from their smaller mice, and as expected, the HTS Ultra is also very light, as I just mentioned earlier, much lighter than I expected for a mouse of this size. However, this larger size does come at a cost, as the build quality of the mouse is worse than the HTX Mini or G-Wolves' other smaller mice, but we'll talk more about this later. But one neat attention to detail is that while most of the mouse's top shell is hollow honeycomb, same kind of structured design as we saw in the HTX Mini shell, just hollow, the sides and a small region of both of the main clicks is filled, which is a great attention to detail, but the mouse's shell still has the same issues as G-Will's previous mice in terms of its grip feeling, but we'll talk more about this later. But in all the games I tested, the HTS Ultra did perform amazingly well, arguably better than G-Will's previous 3395 mice due to the great 3950 implementation here, as well as of course the center tilt feature, as it's a game changer for users with tilted grips like myself. But personally speaking, the mouse didn't feel as good as the HTX Mini in my opinion, and while the HTS Ultra shell is a better size, the build quality and average click implementation on the mouse did hamper its overall feel for me, and we'll talk more about the downsides to this mouse's design later in this video. Now, in terms of build quality and QC, just as a quick disclaimer, keep in mind that my HTS Ultra was sent to me directly by G-Wolves, so take the build quality and QC of my unit with a grain of salt. But that said, overall my HTS Ultra did feel pretty good for the mouse's size, but as I just mentioned, the mouse did develop some issues over my testing. My biggest gripe with the mouse is that at the seam between the top and the base shells, the mouse developed a final mouse worthy pop and creak to it, which was quite annoying as it was right at the mouse's midline, so if I tensed my grip on the mouse's shell during use, I felt the pop and creak of the mouse's shells, which was quite annoying. The rear shell also did have a little bit of flexing to it, as with enough pressure it can warp inward, but this only happened with direct pressure and it was much less noticeable than the side creaking on my unit. And as I just mentioned in the last segment, due to its honeycomb shell design, it has the same issues as the HTX and HTR series shells, as the honeycomb texturing can feel very rough and abrasive to hands over long-term use, and the hollowness of the top shell's honeycomb texturing also makes this mouse much more susceptible to dust and debris, which can be an issue over long term. However, you can prevent this by storing the mouse properly, as we talked about earlier, and you can prevent the grip and abrasion issues by using the included grips. But all that said, one positive to this hollow honeycomb shell is that it does technically increase ventilation to your hands, which can help prevent sweat buildup, though the effects of this will vary from hand size to hand size. And as I just mentioned, another gripe I did have with the HTS Ultra is its clicks, as the main and side clicks are using Wano and TTC switches, which feel average at best, and are a big downgrade from the mel0n switches we saw in the HTX Mini, specifically in terms of actuation weight, as the mouse's side buttons are extremely heavy. But to be clear, this is very much a personal nitpick, as many people prefer the feel of Wano or TTC switches over on mel0n switches, and over my testing I never had any serious performance issues with the main or side switches. I just wasn't a fan of their click feel and actuation weight. And aside from those issues, the rest of the HTH Ultra was solid. Again, my biggest issue is the side shell creaking that developed, but aside from that, the mouse's build quality and QC is good, and as an added benefit, the mouse's internal design is very similar to the HTX Minis, so the mouse is very easy to service, so cleaning or modding replacing components is very easy, but we'll talk more about this later. Now, in terms of weight, as expected for a G-Wolves mouse, the HTS Ultra is an extremely lightweight mouse, and despite its larger size, G-Wolves is advertising this mouse is going to weigh approximately 29.5 to 32.5 grams, which is a very impressive weight spec for a mouse of this size, especially considering that the HTX Mini, which was much smaller, weighed around 28.1 grams in its stock configuration. Now, my HTS Ultra in its stock configuration with the 4 pre-installed PTFE dot skates weighs around 30.9 grams. With the full-size stock skates installed, the mouse weighs around 31.3 grams. With the full-size grips plus a hump cover, the mouse weighs 32.9 grams, and this configuration with the full-size stock skates comes in at 33.3 grams, whereas with the modular grips, the mouse weighs around 32.1 grams, and with the full-size skates added in, the mouse weighs around 32.5 grams, and without any grips or skates, the HTS Ultra weighs around 30.6 grams. So overall, the HTS Ultra is ever so slightly outside its advertised 32.5 gram weight spec. However, this is something that we commonly see with G-Wolves mice, as they're usually around 1 gram over their advertised weight spec once you add in the weight of skates and grip tape. But since the grips are modular now, you don't add as much weight with them as you would with the previous non-modular versions, which is a nice attention to detail. However, all that said, I still would like to see G-Wolves update their weight specs on the HTS Ultras and for their other mice for that matter's product pages to better show the mouse's true weight configuration with the grips and skates, as since none of G-Wolves mice have a coating, you will need to use the included grips to grip the mouse consistently, so having weight specs for the grips added onto their mice would be a nice attention to detail. But again, while the mouse is slightly over the advertised weight spec, the HTS Ultra's weight is still very impressive, especially considering the mouse's size, and as I mentioned earlier, in the hand the mouse feels insanely light, borderline a little too light for me, but it's still very impressive nonetheless. Now for balancing, the HTS Ultra is forwardly balanced as expected for a mouse with a forward sensor position, but as I mentioned earlier, unlike the HTX Mini, which was balanced slightly below the forward sensor location, the HTS Ultra is balanced at the sensor's physical location, but more towards the lower end of it. This means that where you'll naturally grip the mouse to match its balancing point, your fingers will align with the mouse's sensor location. Now this does mean that the forward sensor won't be as impactful as it would be on a mouse with a more forward positioning, but a central balancing point. However, combined with the HTS Ultra's balancing, the mouse's forward sensor still gives the mouse that snappier feeling, as I mentioned earlier. But if you've never used a mouse with a forward sensor position, or a balancing point for that matter, it'll take some time to get accustomed to it, especially if you're coming from a mouse with a more central balancing point. So if you get the HTS Ultra, be sure to give yourself a couple days to let your aim adjust to the sensor's positioning and the mouse's balancing. But aside from the X-axis balancing, the mouse's Y-axis balancing is also perfect, which is a great thing to see. Historically speaking, non-G-Wolves ultralight mice are a little left-leaning, but the HTS Ultra doesn't have that issue, which is great to see. I would also like to note, due to the mouse's weight and balancing, if you use the mouse wired, it can be very easily unbalanced, as it's very forward heavy with a cable, but seeing as the mouse is optimized for wireless use, this is to be expected, and we've seen this happen on every single G-Wolves mouse I've covered to date, so this isn't exactly surprising. In terms of shape, the HTS Ultra is a symmetrical mouse as expected, but as I mentioned earlier, it's a much larger shell than we commonly see from G-Wolves, as they generally make much smaller symmetrical shapes, but despite this not being their run-of-the-mill mouse, their execution of this larger symmetrical shape is quite good. Now the shell is right-hand optimized as expected, but due to its symmetrical nature, the mouse is technically ambidextrous, however left-handed users won't have access to side buttons. In terms of dimensions, the HTS Ultra measures 113mm long, measured from the tip of the main clicks to the end point of the rear shell. For widths, at the front region of the shell, at the bottom it measures approximately 53.2mm wide, and at the top it measures approximately 60mm wide. At the mid region of the shell, at the bottom the shell measures approximately 54.4mm wide, and at the top it measures approximately 56.2mm wide, and at the rear region of the shell, at the bottom, the shell measures approximately 61mm wide. For heights, at the front of the shell, at the end region of the main clicks, the shell measures approximately 18.6mm tall. At the peak of the mouse's top shell, it measures approximately 40.1mm tall, and at the rear, the shell tapers down to measure approximately 7.6mm at its endpoint. For shell profiles, looking at the mouse from the top, we can see the larger symmetrical shape and the mouse's very slight hourglass-like curvature to its sides with the typical rounded rear region. Looking from the base, we can better see the mouse's symmetrical shape and the aforementioned slight hourglass-like side curvature, and we can also see that the bottom shell is much thinner than the upper shell, hence the difference in widths I just mentioned. From the sides, we can see the mouse's top shell profile, which is centrally focused in its design, terminating ever so slightly behind the mouse's physical midline, with a gradual forward curvature and a much steeper, more aggressive rear curvature. From the front, we can best see the gradual top shell's forward shell curvature as I just mentioned, and we can also get a good look at the sides of the mouse, which at the top region of the shell are very outwardly tilted with a lip-like curvature to them towards the top, and while being outwardly tilted at the front, the aggressiveness of the outward curvature tapers off as you go towards the mid to end region of the side shell, but due to the very aggressive angling of the front side profile, again I'd highly recommend using the included grip tapes, as the side shell specifically towards the front is very difficult to grip due to the curvature and the lack of coating on the shell. And lastly, from the rear, we can best see the rear shell's profile, which as I mentioned earlier, has that steeper curvature to it, and we can see that the hump itself has the typical rounded curvature, the most typical profile for most if not all symmetrical mice. For contact areas, as I mentioned earlier, due to the HTS Ultra's larger size, this is the first G-Wolves mouse I've used that's actually comfortable and usable for my larger hands, and because of this, unlike G-Wolves' previous mice which I could only use with a fingertip grip, the HTS Ultra is much more universal when it comes to grip compatibility, which is a great thing to see. Now before we talk about other hand sizes, grip compatibility, and hand size compatibility, let's go over the contact areas for my 1905 by 12.7 centimeter hands using a tilted claw grip. For palm contact, the larger shell and steeper rear profile gives a generous amount of mid-palm contact and a lot of upper mid-thenar contact, and there is also a good amount of mid to low hyperthenar contact as well. For finger contact, my thumb rests just before the top region of the side shell, just in front of the forward side button. Now because of this, if you have very large hands like mine, your thumb might rest against the forward side button due to its positioning. However, over my testing, I never had any issues with accidentally actuating the side button due to its extremely heavy actuation weight, but just keep this in mind. And if needed, I could also angle my thumb to rest more towards the upper mid region of the shell if needed. For my index and middle finger contact, they rested towards the end region of the main clicks, around where the solid honeycomb areas are, and for ring and pinky finger contact, my ring finger rested towards the upper top region of the mouse's right side, and my pinky finger rested just below that, around the mid region of the side shell, slightly below the mouse's midline. But uniquely, since the HTS Ultra is so light, despite its size, I can also fingertip the mouse with ease, and with that grip style, my thumb rests around the upper mid region of the mouse's left side, roughly at the midpoint between the two side buttons. My index and middle finger rest around the mid region of the shell buttons, right around the part where the scroll wheel is, while my ring finger rests at the upper mid region of the mouse's left side, slightly below the mouse's midline, and my pinky finger sits further below that, resting around the lower mid region of the mouse's left side profile. And in terms of grip compatibility for various hand sizes, from my estimations, the HTS Ultra with small hands roughly measuring around 11.7 to 7.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips. For small to medium sized hands measuring approximately 13.5 by 9 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips again. For medium sized hands measuring approximately 15 by 10 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm, claw, and fingertip grips. For medium to large hands measuring approximately 16 by 11 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm, claw, and fingertip grips. For large hands measuring approximately 17 by 12 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips. And for extra large hands measuring approximately 19 by 13 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips. Just like the other G-Wolves mice I've covered here on the channel, the HTS Ultra doesn't have a coating applied to its shell, which is by design, as G-Wolves designs all of their mice to be used with the included grip tape and doesn't apply coatings to any of their shells, as coating layers not only add weight to the mouse, they also degrade, affecting the mouse's long-term use. So just like we saw in the HTX Mini, the HTS Ultra shell has that same kind of matte feel to it, which in combination with the honeycomb texturing might be grippable for some hands, but for wet hands it can be quite slippery, and in both cases the shell, due to its texturing, can feel quite rough and abrasive over long-term use, so I'd highly recommend using the included grips, as they massively improve the shell's gripability with both wet and dry hands, and cover the shell's honeycomb texturing so it doesn't feel so rough and abrasive. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the HTS Ultra includes the same fantastic type of grips we've seen included with G-Wolf's previous mice, but this set has been updated to be modular, which is a great improvement. The grips have the same raised linear and hexagonal texturing with a very sticky coating applied to their surface, which makes the grip surface very grippy for both wet and dry hands, which when installed on the mouse makes the HTS Ultra shell much easier to grip and smoother to the touch, as they cover the shell's honeycomb texturing. These grips are also extremely durable, as I've talked about in my previous G-Wolf mice reviews, so their performance will remain consistent over long-term use, and as an added benefit, the grips are quite reusable as well, so you can adjust or reapply the grips as needed without damaging them, which is a great attention to detail. But since this grip is modular, not being full-size pieces like we saw included with the HTX Mini, you can add less overall weight to the mouse, as you only need to install the grip pieces you want, which, as I talked about earlier, cuts off about a gram off of the grip's total weight. But oddly enough, I saw a few people complain about these modular grips, but I quite like this, as since the mouse doesn't have a coating, just like all of G-Wolf's previous mice, you'll need to use the grips on the shell to make it easier to hold, but the previous sets of grips added more weight than necessary as they were full size, but with these modular grips you can only add the parts you need, which is a great change. But while the grips perform really well, my only gripe with them is that the set that's included with the HTS Ultra doesn't include side button covers, which is quite disappointing, as since the side buttons don't have a coating, they can be very slippery, so in the future having side button grips would be a welcome change. I'd also love to see the rear hump covers that are included with the HTS Ultra be modular as well, as that way you could split the grips and install them deeper on the edges of the rear shell to improve thenar and hypothenar contact and anchoring on the HTS Ultra. Lastly, I also wanted to mention that these stock grips are on the thicker side and do have a noticeable edge to them, just like all the previous versions, which might be a deal breaker for some people, and some people might not like their surface texturing, and if this is the case for you, you can always use aftermarket grips like the X-Rabbit Cicada Wing 2.0s or Geckos 2.0, as both perform similar to the G-Wolf stock grips, just in a thinner form factor with no physical texturing, but keep in mind that these and other aftermarket grip tapes are likely thinner than the G-Wolf's ones, so they might not be as effective as covering the shell's honeycomb texturing, so if you are going to use aftermarket grips here on G-Wolf's mice, make sure you get some thicker ones so you don't feel the shell's honeycomb texturing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the HTS Ultra's main clicks are well implemented despite their switch choice, but there are some aspects of the buttons themselves that are downgrades from the main click implementations we've seen on G-Wolf's other mice. But before we talk about that, let's talk about the main clicks themselves, which are longer than we commonly see due to the larger shape, and they are more outwardly tilted and have a very slight concaveness or indentation in their end region. However, since it's so slight, it doesn't really do much to improve the main click's gripability or finger placement. The main clicks also share the same honeycomb texturing as the rest of the HTS Ultra's shell, but while most of the shell is hollow honeycomb, the main clicks are too, with the exception of their end region, as the honeycomb has a small filled region where most people rest their fingers, but as I mentioned earlier, even the filled regions of this shell are very difficult to grip, and just like the rest of the HTS Ultra's shells, the main clicks don't have a coating applied to them, so they can be quite tricky to grip. Therefore, again, I highly advise using the included grips on the main clicks as they make the shell buttons much easier to consistently grip. In terms of click heights, at the end region of the shell buttons they measure approximately 18.6 millimeters tall. At the mid region of the buttons, around where the scroll wheel is, they measure approximately 25.5 millimeters tall, and at the top region they measure approximately 32.7 millimeters tall. But one great aspect to these main clicks is that just like the HTX Mini's main clicks, both of the main clicks are very well stabilized with very little play to both buttons even when actuated, and the main clicks are also indented into the shell, so both the main clicks are free from any interference issues from your thumb or pinky finger resting against the upper side shell. In terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the HTS Ultra's main clicks. As you can probably tell from the sound test, and since I mentioned it earlier, the HTS Ultra is using Wano switches for its main clicks, specifically the Wano Blue Shell Pink Dot switches, which are rated for the standard 80 million cycles. These switches give the HTS Ultra a very average click feel, being around a 60 gram force in terms of their actuation weight. However, this does slightly increase if you click towards the top region of the clicks where they feel more around a 65 gram force, whereas to the mid to end region they'll be more around the aforementioned 60 gram force. In terms of travel, both the main clicks are very well tensioned, having a very slight range of pre-travel and a medium range of post-travel, and both clicks do have a snappy rebound so they are quite spammable. But one big issue with the main clicks I noticed is that much like the HTR AK's main clicks, the main clicks do protrude out of the front of the mouse by approximately 7 millimeters or so. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does make the main clicks much more susceptible to damage, as if the mouse is dropped and it lands on the clicks they'll likely break, and just like the HTR AK's main clicks, the ends of the shell buttons have a sharp point to them, and it hasn't been cut down like it was on the HTR Pro or HTX Mini's main clicks. This also makes the main clicks more susceptible to damage, as these edges could get caught on something inside a bag or carrying case, or if you flick your mouse super hard and the edges of the clicks hit your keyboard, there's a high likelihood they'll get damaged. Because of this, I'd love to see G-Wolves cut down the sharper ends to these clicks just as they did on the HTX Mini to help mitigate the potential for damage. And lastly, in terms of debounce, by default the main clicks use a 3 millisecond debounce filter, but you can adjust this as needed via the WebDriver. For the HTS Ultra's side buttons, G-Wolves has opted for a more standard design we've seen them use on their previous mice, as they're shaped more akin to the ones you'd find on your average symmetrical mouse, but with the typical G-Wolves twist to their implementation, which is a good thing and a bad thing in this case. Now the buttons themselves are larger pill-shaped buttons with a very rounded curvature to them and a very aggressive forward angling, a much more aggressive angle that we commonly see for G-Wolves side buttons. The side buttons are also forward positioned in the mouse's shell, approximately 6 millimeters forward of the mouse's physical midline, and roughly even with the mouse's forward balancing point. This makes the side buttons very easy to reach, which is a nice attention to detail. However, as I mentioned earlier, because the buttons are so forwardly positioned and tilted, your thumb will likely end up resting against the forward side button when gripping the shell. Thankfully, I never ran into any misactuation issues because of this, but keep this in mind if you have larger hands. Another unique aspect to the HTS Ultra's side buttons is that they're very pronounced on the mouse's side shell, much more so than we've seen before, which does improve their usability slightly. However, since the side buttons don't have a coating like the rest of the mouse's shell, they can be very slippery and difficult to actuate despite this. Normally, I'd suggest using the included side button covers to resolve this issue, but the HTS Ultra doesn't come with side button covers unlike the previous G-Wolves mice, which is very disappointing. So if you plan on getting the HTS Ultra, I'd advise investing in some good aftermarket grip tapes for the side buttons to improve their usability. But while the physical design of the side buttons is interesting to say the least, one very positive aspect to them is that their stabilization is quite good, with very little play to either of the buttons even when fully actuated. In terms of audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the HTS Ultra's side clicks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, instead of the mel0n D2LS-21S switches we see in G-Wolves commonly used for their side buttons, the HTS Ultra is using a new switch type, one I've only seen used twice before, the TGC Brown Shell Blue Dot switches. These are the same side button switches that Pulsar used on the X2CL and HitScan used on the Hyperlight, but unlike those versions which were rated for 3 million cycles, the ones here in the HTS Ultra are rated for 5 million cycles, but they have a much heavier actuation weight than those other implementations. implementations I just mentioned. Now in terms of click feel, unlike the main clicks which had an average actuation weight, the side buttons are much heavier, having an actuation force of approximately 70 to 75 gram force, 10 to 15 gram force higher than the main clicks. This definitely hampers their use as they're already hard to grip and actuate due to the lack of coating in their shaping, and the higher actuation weight makes them even trickier to use as they're so heavy they feel very awkward to utilize. I definitely think that G-Will should tweak these side buttons to have an actuation force similar to the main clicks, as currently they're just too heavy and they make the mouse feel very unbalanced in terms of its click feel, which is a very disappointing aspect to this mouse and a big downgrade from the great balanced click feel we've seen on the HTX Mini and G-Will's other mice. But that said, while the actuation weight is a little high, one positive to the side buttons is that they're very well tensioned, so both the buttons pre and post travel ranges are quite low, and despite the higher actuation weight, the switches do have a snappy rebound, so they are spammable, just not as spammable as the much lighter actuation main clicks are. Next, let's talk about the HTS Ultra's scroll wheel, which sadly is another aspect of this mouse that's a big disappointment in terms of its implementation. Now, the scroll wheel itself is the standard plastic style wheel with a rubber texturing wrapped around it. However, instead of the flattened rubber texturing we saw in the HTX Mini scroll wheel, the HTS Ultra uses a linear dotted texturing we saw utilized on the HTR series scroll wheels. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing as the wheel is still easy to grip, but it is less grippable than the HTX Mini scroll wheel in my opinion, though still totally usable by all means. But where the scroll wheel falls short when compared to G-Will's other implementations and many other scroll wheel types for that matter is its height, as the wheel is very shallow in the mouse's top shell, even more so than the HTX Mini's shallower scroll wheel. Now on paper this might not seem like a big deal, but it does significantly impact the scroll range of the mouse quite a bit, and it makes the scroll wheel harder to actuate, especially if you have bigger hands like myself. Now in reality this won't be massively impactful in terms of the gaming use case unless you use scroll wheel to jump or portal in Splitgate 2 for example, but I will say it's more impactful for productivity and general use, but it is still something I wanted to point out as generally speaking G-Will's scroll wheels are a little more pronounced, and this is a very unique aspect to this mouse that doesn't really work in its favor. But aside from the scroll wheel's physical design, inside the HTS Ultra is using a TTC 12mm dustproof encoder for the scroll wheel, which has a similar actuation force to the side buttons, being approximately 60 to 67 gram force. This is a good thing in this case as it makes the scroll wheel very controllable, and the encoder gives the scroll wheel quite pronounced scroll points, stronger than the ones on the HTX Mini, which further improves the scroll wheel controllability and makes scrolling the wheel or scroll wheel clicking very consistent without any misactuation issues. And speaking of the scroll wheel click, inside the HTS Ultra is using a TTC pillar wedge for the scroll wheel, which unsurprisingly has a higher actuation weight of approximately 60 to 65 gram force, slightly lighter than the side buttons but heavier than the main clicks, and as expected for a pillar switch, it has the expected weaker rebound and non-spammable nature that we commonly see, but again this is pretty par for the course when it comes to a scroll wheel switch. Next, let's talk sensor and MCU. As I mentioned earlier, the HTS Ultra is using the Pixart 3950, which is a nice upgrade from the 3395s we've seen G-Wills use previously. This improves the mouse performance in various ways, but we'll talk about that more in a moment, but first we need to talk about the mouse's sensor position. Just like the HTX Mini, the HTS Ultra is utilizing a more forward sensor position, which is located at the 64mm mark, approximately 8mm forward of the mouse's 56.5mm midline. This gives the HTS Mini the expected faster, snappier feeling that all forward sensor positions do, just to a slightly lower degree due to the forward balancing point. And as I said earlier, if you've never used a mouse with a forward sensor or balancing point for that matter, again it will take some time to get accustomed to this, especially if you're coming from a mouse with a more central balancing point or sensor position. So if you get the HTS Ultra or any mouse with a forward sensor position and balancing point for that matter, be sure to give yourself a couple days to let your aim adjust to the sensor positioning and balancing. Now that we've talked about sensor positioning, let's talk about the sensor itself. Inside, the HTS Ultra is using a 3950, specifically the Pixart Paw 3950 DM-T5QU SKU instead of the 3395s we commonly see, which gives some notable spec improvements here to the HTS Ultra compared to G-Will's previous mice using the 3395s. The first of which is that the 3950 sports a DPI range of 50 to 30,000, 4,000 DPI higher than the 3395's DPI range, and it is adjustable via 50 DPI steps. The sensor also has a slightly higher IPS and acceleration acceleration rating, and additional 0.7mm LOD level in addition to the standard 1 and 2mm levels. Motion sync and angle snapping are also enabled on the sensor, but there is no ripple setting on this specific sensor implementation. But most importantly, the 3950 supports the aforementioned sensor tilt feature, which is a godsend for people like myself with an angled grip style, and the tilt range is the standard 30-degree range in both the left and right directions. And in terms of MCU, as expected, the HTS Ultra is using the same MCU we've seen G-Will use on all of their previous mice as of late, the Nordic 52840 MCU, which is the MCU of choice for most if not all gaming mice. Now, in terms of high polling rate implementations here on the HTS Ultra, as we've historically seen with G-Wolves mice, their implementations have always been very solid, and even though the HTS Ultra is using a new sensor type, the implementation here is solid as always. Now, on wired connectivity, the mouse supports 125Hz to 1000Hz, and on the wireless 2.4 GHz connectivity, the mouse supports 125Hz to 8000Hz. Sadly, there is no 4 or 8K wired polling here on the HTS Ultra, but hopefully we'll see this feature added onto future G-Wolves mice. And over my testing, both the wireless and wired 1K polling rates were very well implemented, and the wireless 2, 4, and 8K hertz rates were also very well implemented as I mentioned earlier, and I didn't run into any stuttering or instability issues on most of the polling rates. The only exception to this would be the 8K hertz polling rate, but the instability was caused by the age of my system, not the mouse's implementation. Now for battery, as I mentioned earlier, the deluxe versions of the HTS Ultra are using the expected 250 mAh battery, the same size that G-Wolves have used on many of their other mice, but again remember that the standard version of the HTS Ultra is using a larger 300 mAh battery, so there will be a difference in the runtime between the standard and deluxe versions of this mouse. Now according to G-Wolves, they advertised that the HTS Ultra's runtime will be 80 hours on 1K Hz, but they didn't specify whether this was measured on the deluxe or standard versions, nor what settings were used to measure this. Now from my testing with my HTX Ultra Deluxe running the version 1.0.38 firmware set to 1600 DPI, auto sleep set to 600 seconds, motion sync disabled, and the base LED also disabled and placed on a mouse jiggler to simulate constant motion, the mouse's runtime on 1K Hz was approximately 68 hours, on 2K Hz it was approximately 41 hours, on 4K Hz it was approximately 38 hours, and on 8K Hz it was approximately 27 hours. But keep in mind that these estimates are based off of constant motion. In reality, your mouse won't be constantly moving and auto sleep will kick in to save power, so the actual runtime of the HTS Ultra will likely be longer than my estimated values, but that said, there is definitely some power optimizations that need to be done here, as generally speaking the 3950 is way more power efficient than the 3395 is, and I'll assume we'll see G-Wolves improve the mouse's power efficiency and runtime in the future, so be sure to install any future firmware updates on your mouses that will likely improve the HTS Ultra's runtime. And all that said, I will also would love to see G-Wolves update the product pages for the HTS Ultra and its various versions to better reflect the proper runtime for the different versions, including the runtimes of the various report rates, as currently it's very difficult to tell what the runtime of the HTS Ultra it will be given the vague battery estimates. But one great thing about the HTS Ultra is that just like the HTX Mini, the mouse is very easy to surface and the internal design leaves plenty of room for modding options, so if you'd like to mod the battery out for a smaller or larger capacity one, you can do so very easily, but we'll talk about this later in the HTS Ultra's teardown video, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that. Next, let's talk software. Now, the HTS Ultra is using the same G-Wolves web-based software that all the previous G-Wolves mice have used, and as I said when I reviewed the HTX Mini, I quite like this G-Wolves web-based software as it's easy to navigate in use. Now, keep in mind though, the software only works on Chromium-based browsers such as Edge, Chrome, etc., and the WebDriver links will be down in the video description, and once you load into the page, you can click the connect button, select your mouse from the drop-down menu, and you can connect your mouse to the web-based driver. Now, the software is a single page layout, but one with multiple tabs in it, all with different purposes. Firstly, in the DPI tab, you can adjust the mouse's DPI levels and set the number of onboard profiles, and you can also customize the mouse's lighting or disable it entirely. Under the key settings tab, you can rebind all the keys on the mouse if needed, but sadly there's no option to rebind a key to swap between the mouse's profiles, so if you utilize multiple profiles here, you'll need to swap through them via the software manually. Under the parameters tab, you can adjust the mouse's debound settings for the mouse's main clicks and scroll wheel, adjust the mouse's polling rate, enable or disable angle snapping wrapping and motion sync, as well as set the mouse's auto sleep timer. If you don't see some of these options in your software, click the little arrow down to the top right corner and the menu should expand to show all these additional options. And overall, just as seen with G-Wolf's other mice, the software implementation is quite good, and the only thing I really like to see improved would be adding a profile toggle or swap rebind added to the mouse's rebind options. But aside from this is a very minimal nitpick, and the overall software implementation for the web-based driver is fantastic. In terms of repairability, historically G-Wolf's mice, despite their smaller size and complex engineering, have always been quite serviceable, and the same goes here for the HTS Ultra, but its larger size makes servicing the unit much easier than G-Wolf's other mice, and it also has a very similar disassembly process to the HTX Mini, as the internal design is very easy to service, which is a great thing to see. But all that said, if you need to open the mouse to repair a component, mod something, or just to clean the internals, it's quite easy to do so, and I'll talk all about how to disassemble the mouse and more about its internal specs, its modding options, and much more in the HTS Ultra's teardown video, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. Now, in terms of stock skates, as we've seen with G-Wolf's previous mice, the included skates are fine. Not my personal favorite kind, but they do the job. And both the dot and full-size versions are 100% PTFE skates, so they'll perform more akin to a mouse's factory stock skates, which again is totally fine for soft pad use, but I wouldn't recommend using them on hard pads as their softer material will wear and degrade extremely quickly. As such, I much preferred aftermarket skates over the stock ones here on the HTS Ultra, and just like we saw in the HTR and HTX series mice, the HTS Ultra's base is completely flat, so not only can you use a wide variety of skate installation positions or methods, the mouse is fully compatible with aftermarket skates of most shapes and sizes, which is fantastic to see. But that said, there isn't nearly as much usable area on the HTX Ultra's base as there was on the HTX Mini's base, specifically towards the rear of the mouse, so sometimes installing aftermarket skates was a little difficult, but the install areas aside, after I tested the mouse's stock skates, I opted to use the X-Ray Pad Jade Air dots the remainder of my testing, and they worked perfectly fine here on the HTS Ultra. But as I mentioned earlier, the mouse also includes these two sheet of foam pads, which is a new accessory included with G-Wolf's mice, and the same ones that we saw in the HTX Mini, which have a very interesting use case. Now, both of these sheets include 30 foam pads, but they have differing heights, as one set is 1mm tall, the other set is 1.5mm tall, but both sets have the same widths, measuring approximately 6mm wide. These pads act similar in concept to the layers of SMPF foam we find in the X-Ray Pad Air series skates, as they're designed to sit under the mouse's skate to act as a buffering layer. But since the G-Wolf's foam is harder, it's not as effective when it comes to reducing audio and physical feedback from the skates, but what it does better is that it raises the height of the skates, as their harder material doesn't compress as much as a softer SMPF material does. Now, G-Wolf says these are included to accommodate higher LOD levels, which makes sense considering their stock skates are so small and short, but in my opinion, they're more effective at raising the skates so they're taller, helping to avoid bottoming out issues when using dot skates on softer pads. Now, since the HTS Ultra's base is completely flat, this isn't necessarily an issue per se, but these foam pads are very useful on other mice that have deeper skate cutouts, so I'd recommend keeping these on hand as these can be quite useful. Just remember to adjust your mouse's LOD to account for the added height from these foam pads. And lastly, let's talk about stock cables. As I mentioned earlier, just like the HTX Mini, the HTS Ultra includes two stock cable types, the first of which is a standard USB A to C cable, but it's a thicker and more rigid type with a semi-rough paracord wrapping and a non-tilted USB-C end, and this cable is most similar to the average stock cable you'd find included with just a general gaming mouse. The second cable is also USB A to C cable, but it's much thinner and more flexible, but it still doesn't have a tilted USB-C end, and it has a smoother paracord wrapping. Now, both these cables perform the same, and I didn't run into any issues using either of them over my testing, and remember that these cables are interchangeable, so you can use whatever cable type you prefer here with your HTS Ultra. Now, normally I would critique these included cables for being too rigid or not having a tilted USB-C end, but since the mouse isn't designed to be a wired mouse, nor does it support polling rates above 1000Hz on wired, I'm going to give G-Wolf's a pass here. And as I mentioned earlier, as we've seen with G-Wolf's previous mice before, if you use the mouse wired, the mouse will feel very forward heavy as it's so light the cable's weight will unbalance it, but similar to how the USB A to C cables lack a tilted USB-C end and are a little too rigid to be used, since the mouse only supports 1K polling via its wired connectivity, this isn't the biggest deal, but keep this in mind if you plan on using the HTS Ultra wired. Alright, in closing, overall the HTS Ultra is okay. That's the best thing I could really say about it in all honesty. Initially I was really excited as this mouse on paper looked to be ideal for my hand size, and having having such a large mouse with such low weight seemed too good to be true, and sadly that is the case here, as the design of the mouse repeats many of the same flaws we've seen on G-Wolf's previous mice and introduces some new ones, particularly the shell creaking issues, which was my biggest gripe with the mouse, as the constant creaking and popping made the usage experience quite negative. Now, to be fair, I could have just gotten a lemon unit with bad QC which caused these shell issues, but even if my unit didn't have these issues, I still think the mouse is just okay, and mice like the HTX Mini, despite having a smaller shell and a last gen sensor, are just better overall in my opinion. But while the HTS Ultra Deluxe is sadly a little underwhelming, G-Wolves is releasing an even bigger mouse in the near future, the recently revealed HTM, which hopefully will be a much better mouse than the HTS Ultra, but I'll be reviewing that mouse when it launches, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll also have a full teardown for the HTS Ultra Deluxe releasing soon, in which I'll show you how to fully disassemble the mouse as well as go over the individual component weights, modding options, and much more. So if you want to learn how to service, mod, or just clean your HTS Ultra Deluxe, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Big thanks again to G-Wolf for sending over the HTS Ultra for review. I greatly appreciate it, and big thank you to all of our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you'd like to support my efforts with the in-depth reviews and the teardown project, consider becoming a member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a channel member gives you early access to all upcoming content. So if you'd like to support my efforts here on the channel, consider becoming a channel member today. But that's everything for today. Thanks for watching my review of the G-Wolves HTS Ultra Deluxe, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.